Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're really going to get into it,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
Judges chapter 8. So we're talking about Gideon, right? And he's just coming off this,
Huge victory. Yeah.
this huge victory against the Midianites. And, we're not just going to talk about the actual battle itself, but
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more here than,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this chapter is less about the actual like the battle itself and more about what happens after.
right,
So
exactly.
it really becomes this deep dive into leadership
Yeah,
and community dynamics and the long-lasting, consequences of choices.
right. And those consequences can be, even if you have good intentions,
Exactly.
which is really interesting. It makes you
Yeah,
think
that does.
about, like, how do we make decisions and
Yeah.
what are the things that we need to think about. But so Gideon, he's exhausted, right? His army is totally spent. They're running on fumes, but they're still chasing after these Midianite kings.
So that again.
Yeah, they got to finish the job. And so they're passing by these towns, Succoth and Penuel, and they're like, hey, can we get some help here? We just need basic supplies just to keep going. And those towns, they just flat out refuse.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this refusal, I mean, obviously it's being inhospitable,
Yeah.
but it also speaks to this crucial element, I think, of how ancient Israelite society was structured, this idea of communal responsibility.
Right.
Because, their survival back then really often depended on how strong their community was.
Yeah.
So to refuse aid to your fellow Israelites wasn't just, like a personal snub. This was like,
A big deal.
yeah, a crack in the foundation of their whole society.
And Gideon, he doesn't let it go
No, he doesn't.
at all. He warns them, there are going to be consequences for this.
Right.
But he's got to keep going. He's got to move forward.
Right.
So he captures those kings,
Yeah.
carries out the execution, fulfills his mission, but
He
then,
goes back.
yeah, he circles back.
And, deals with those towns for their lack of support.
Right. And that's where I think it gets really tricky.
Yeah.
Because, for us today,
Yeah.
we might look at that and say, wow, that's really harsh.
Yeah, a little extreme.
But,
But in the context of the time,
yeah, you have to think about it differently.
it really was about upholding this social contract, this system of mutual reliance that was vital for their well-being.
Totally.
The refusal of these towns wasn't just about Gideon, it was about this potential for a breakdown of their entire system of support.
It's so fascinating how a seemingly simple act, like just denying some supplies, can have such much deeper implications.
Oh, absolutely. And, this theme of actions having these ripple effects,
Yeah.
that comes up again later in the chapter, but in a really different way.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
the Israelites are totally impressed with Gideon. They're like, this guy's amazing. Let's make him king.
Yeah, he's our hero.
But he says, no, no, no. God is your king.
That's our only king.
Only true king seems super humble, right?
Very humble.
But then he takes some of the spoils of war and he makes this ephod, this priestly garment.
okay.
And it becomes this object of worship for the Israelites and leads them away from God.
So he's trying to do something he thinks is good.
Yeah, I mean, this act was meant to be this symbol of faith, but it ends up totally backfiring.
Oh, wow.
And it really highlights how even well-intentioned actions can have unforeseen and, disastrous consequences.
Yeah, so you think you're doing something good and it turns out to be a big mistake.
Exactly. I mean, it's a potent example, of how leadership isn't just about strength or even good intentions. It's about really understanding the consequences, the far-reaching consequences of your choices and how those choices impact the community you're leading.
Yeah, it really is. I'm thinking about those like memes you see online,
Oh, yeah.
what I thought it was doing versus how it actually turned out.
Totally.
I mean, Gideon probably thought he was honoring God, but he just inadvertently like set the stage for idolatry.
Exactly. And it gets to the heart of, I think, why Judges 8 is so fascinating. It doesn't shy away from the complexities, even with their heroes.
Right.
Gideon is celebrated, but he's also flawed. He achieves great things, but he also makes critical errors.
Right. And I think that this ephod incident, like, it ties back to that earlier point about community accountability.
Oh, interesting.
Not just, punishing those who don't help,
Yeah.
but also in the sense of, leaders being accountable for their actions and the impact those actions have on their followers.
That's a really insightful connection. We often think about accountability as just like an individual thing, but it applies to leadership as well.
Right.
Gideon, in a way, he failed to hold himself accountable for the potential consequences of creating that ephod.
It's almost like he forgot the very lesson he just enforced.
Yeah.
With Succoth and Penuel, their actions had community-level consequences, and so did his,
Yeah.
but in a more like insidious way.
Precisely. And it makes me wonder, How often do we, in our own leadership roles, whether at work or in our families or even our communities, fail to consider those ripple effects?
Yeah.
We may have the best intentions, but are we really thinking through, those long-term impacts?
It's a sobering thought for sure. And I guess that begs the question, like, what safeguards can we put in place to prevent these kinds of things from happening?
That's the critical question. I think it starts with awareness. Being mindful that our actions, no matter how small, can have those impacts, and seeking out diverse perspectives, considering the potential downsides, and being open to course correction when we need it. And I think maybe even more importantly, being humble enough to admit when we've made a mistake and then taking those steps to fix it.
You mentioned diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
That makes me think back to that conflict with the Ephraimites. They were angry Gideon hadn't included them in the initial battle, but instead of like escalating the situation, he diffused it by acknowledging their contribution. They captured those key Midianite leaders.
It's such a brilliant example of leadership through communication.
Yeah.
Instead of becoming defensive, he recognizes their feelings and then praises their efforts.
Yeah.
It was like a masterclass in conflict resolution, shifting the focus from blame to accomplishment.
It makes you wonder how different things might have been if he had approached the ephod situation with that same kind of communication, and foresight, maybe consulting others, anticipating potential issues, seeking counsel.
It's intriguing to consider, isn't it? It really highlights how crucial communication and collaboration are, and an awareness of potential pitfalls, even when you're dealing with something seemingly as positive as, a symbol of faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got this incredibly complex picture of Gideon emerging here, war hero, reluctant leader,
Yeah.
someone capable of great strategic thinking, but also prone to these missteps. And his story, it keeps unfolding even as the battles are won.
Exactly. And that's where the chapter takes, I think, its most poignant turn after Gideon's victory. There's peace in Israel for 40 years. Like, it coincides with his lifetime. But then after he dies, the Israelites, they fall back into their old ways. They forget God. And sadly, they forget Gideon's contributions too.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. Like all that struggle, all that sacrifice, and it just fades so quickly from memory. It makes you think about how fragile societal progress can be. I know it's like you think they'd be a little more grateful or,
You would think.
at least hesitant to fall back into those same old habits.
Right. Well, it's a potent reminder, I think, that progress, it isn't linear.
Right.
Society, like individuals, we can regress.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to this importance of memory,
Right.
actively preserving the lessons of the past.
So they don't just fade away.
Exactly.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But it's not just repeating the mistakes, it's forgetting the people who helped them overcome those mistakes in the first place.
It's a good point. And that forgetting, I think that's what makes the story so relevant, for us today.
Yeah.
I mean, we live in this world where we're just saturated with information, right?
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with stimulation.
All the time.
So it's so easy to get distracted, to lose sight of what really matters, the values and principles,
Right.
and to forget the sacrifices that were made by, the people who came before us.
I'm thinking about like those deep fake videos that are becoming more and more realistic.
It's great.
It's getting harder and harder to know what's real and what's not.
Absolutely.
And in that environment, remembering and upholding accurate accounts of the past feels even more important.
It is. It's not just about historical accuracy. It's about understanding like the foundations upon which our societies are built
Right.
and remembering those lessons, both the good and the bad that shaped us.
Yeah, so how we resist this, tendency to forget. How do we make sure that the sacrifices and the lessons from the past aren't just lost to all the noise?
Well, I think it starts by actively engaging with history,
Okay.
not just as dates and facts, but as lived experiences,
Yeah.
triumphs and failures that illuminate our own path.
Yeah, like stories we can learn from.
Exactly. And seeking out diverse perspectives, challenging our assumptions, and just being willing to learn from the past.
Both the good and the bad.
Both the good and the bad. Yeah.
And maybe it's about, finding ways to connect those stories to our own lives,
Right.
making them relatable, finding those threads,
Love
that weave through time and connect us.
Yeah, we're having this conversation right now about Gideon thousands of years later.
I know, it's amazing.
Clearly, the story still resonates.
It does.
It still has the power to challenge and inspire.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine if we could tap into that power for other stories, other figures from the past.
It's like we're entrusted with, carrying those stories forward,
Yes,
keeping them alive.
keeping them alive.
Not just as these, dusty relics, but as these living sources of wisdom.
Precisely. And, who knows, maybe in doing so, we might avoid repeating those same mistakes ourselves. Maybe we can break free from those cyclical patterns and create a future that actually honors those sacrifices and those lessons from the past.
That's a really powerful thought to end on.
It is.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me into Judges 8.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how much depth we can find in these ancient stories.
It has been my pleasure, exploring these complexities with you.
Yeah.
And for our listeners out there, we hope this has maybe sparked some new insights for you
Yeah.
into leadership community and the importance of remembering the past.
And remember, the deep dive doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and just keep seeking those hidden depths of knowledge in the world around you.